The sun was slowly setting, painting the glassy surface of the lake in golden and crimson hues. The wind lazily rustled through the tall pines, leaving behind a faint, barely audible whisper. The day was fading, dissolving into a silence that might have seemed peaceful to someone else, but not to her. Margaret Holloway sat in an old, slightly wobbly rocking chair by the window, staring into the void. Long years of loneliness had left a silent trace in her soul. Inside her, there was a void that gave her no peace, even on the brightest days. Exactly 12 years ago, her world had collapsed. The day she lost her husband was a point of no return. Since then, the house that was once filled with voices, laughter, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee had turned into a silent prison where she voluntarily locked herself away. Life flowed slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water gradually eroding a stone. Each day was like the one before. Tea at 7 in the morning, a light breakfast, the garden, books, evening tea, more books, and so it went, day after day. There was no room for surprises in this routine. It seemed as if her existence had turned into a faded photograph, static and devoid of life. But this evening was different. A heavy, uneasy feeling had settled in her chest, inexplicable and lingering, as if something forgotten and ghostly was rising from the depths of her memory. She ran her hand over her arm, trying to warm herself, although the house was not cold. The window remained open, letting in fresh air, but even that could not dispel the strange heaviness that hung over her thoughts. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp sound. The telephone. Its ring echoed unnaturally loudly through the empty rooms, reverberating slightly off the walls. Margaret jumped, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting any calls. Hesitating for a moment, she slowly reached for the receiver. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. "Hello." Her voice sounded unexpectedly hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken aloud in days. "Miss Holloway? This is Leo Grayson." The voice on the other end of the line was deep, with a slight rasp, as if it held the bitterness of cigarette smoke and a warm hint of something inexplicable. There was something familiar in that voice, but Margaret was sure she had never heard it before. "Yes, this is she." Her fingers gripped the receiver tighter. "You left a request for repairs, a cabinet door and a railing. I can come tomorrow at noon if that's convenient for you." For a moment she forgot what he was talking about. She had indeed left a request? Yes, a few days ago. Her kitchen cabinet needed repair, and the stair railing was slightly loose. Margaret had long grown accustomed to minor household problems. But this time she just wanted someone to come, even if it was just to break this cursed silence. "Yes, of course. Tomorrow at noon would be perfect." "Good, then I'll see you tomorrow." Short beeps. That was it. The call lasted no more than a minute, but something in it had affected Margaret more than she wanted to admit. She held the phone in her hands for a long time, as if waiting for the voice on the other end to return. The uneasy feeling did not go away. It only intensified. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. The house was filled with the same silence, but it no longer felt cozy. Over a cup of tea, she looked out the window, watching the sun slowly rise, casting soft hues over the street. Today was the day. By noon, she could feel a strange excitement building in her chest. She didn't like this feeling. It reminded her of forgotten emotions she had long buried deep inside. She was standing in the living room when there was a knock at the door. Sharp, confident, not too loud, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She approached the door and took a deep breath before opening it. Standing before her was a man. Not the elderly craftsman in a dusty overalls she had expected, but a young man, no older than 35. Tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that slightly fell over his forehead. His green eyes, deep and attentive, seemed too observant. He was dressed simply, faded jeans, a t-shirt that hugged his muscular frame, and work boots. In his hands, he held a toolbox, but Margaret didn't notice it right away. She was too busy trying to understand why her heart skipped another beat. "Good afternoon, Miss Holloway." He slightly bowed his head. "I'm Leo." She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. Gathering her thoughts, she finally nodded. "Good afternoon. Come in." When Leo entered, the house seemed to fill with his presence. The air grew thicker, the walls seemed closer, and the silence now sounded different. Margaret understood one thing. This day would definitely change something in her life. Margaret watched Leo as he inspected the stair railing. His movements were confident and precise, as if he had worked in this house before. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't explain. "Have you been doing this for long?" she asked, trying to fill the silence. Leo looked up and smiled slightly. "Since childhood. My father was a carpenter. I learned a lot from him." Margaret nodded, but inside her grew a feeling that it wasn't just about his skill. There was something more in him, something hidden, elusive. When he leaned down to tighten a bolt, his sleeve slightly rolled up, and Margaret noticed a scar running along his forearm like a winding line. "Where did you get that scar?" she asked before she could stop herself. Leo froze for a second, then slowly rolled up his sleeve higher. "Old story." There was a shadow of something in his voice, not just pain, but something he was trying to hide. That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. The image of Leo, his gaze, movements, the tone of his voice, the strange shadow in his eyes, lingered in her thoughts. What was he hiding? She sat in bed, hugging her knees, feeling a strange restlessness stirring inside her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something more, something she couldn't explain. Several days passed. Leo didn't come back, but his presence could still be felt in her house. Margaret noticed that the cabinet he had fixed no longer creaked, but she opened it more often than before, just to remind herself that he had been there. One morning she realized that her hand was reaching for the phone. She wanted to hear his voice. Why? What did she need from him? But before she could dial the number, there was a knock at the door. She held her breath. Leo stood at the door. Margaret didn't know what to say, but something in his gaze told her that he felt the same way. He stepped forward and the air between them grew thicker. Margaret understood. This meeting would change everything. But how? A mixture of anxiety and something dangerously sweet welled up in her chest. She felt a slight electric shock run through her body as their eyes met. Leo didn't move, as if waiting for something. A sign, a word, even a gesture that would let him know he could cross this invisible threshold. Margaret felt her palms grow damp, but she didn't step back. Instead, she took a tiny step forward, so small that only Leo could notice it. The air between them was charged with anticipation, and at that moment, it seemed as if her house, her past, her fears, everything ceased to exist. Only the two of them remained, frozen on the brink of something unknown. Margaret stood at the door for a long time, unable to say the first word. Leo didn't rush to break the silence. His gaze was tense, with a mix of anxiety and hidden desire. "Why did you come?" she finally whispered. Leo ran a hand through his hair, holding his breath. His shoulders tensed, as if he was struggling with himself. "I don't know, Margaret. I shouldn't have." His voice sounded tired, but there was something more in it, something that wouldn't let him leave. "But you're here anyway." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Leo didn't step back. Their eyes met, and in that silent standoff, they both understood. There was no point in denying the obvious. "I think about you." His voice broke mid-sentence, as if the admission was too difficult. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Too fast, too loud. She had expected these words but didn't think she would hear them so soon. The room grew darker, but the light from the street lamp cast long shadows on the walls, giving the moment an intimacy. They stood like that for a long time until Leo reached out, barely touching her hand. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. Margaret closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the moment. For the first time in many years, she was not afraid. When night fell over the house, Margaret felt that their conversations were no longer just a casual acquaintance. It was more like playing with fire. Leo stayed longer than usual. They sat in the kitchen, the tea in their cups long cold, but neither wanted to end the conversation. The topics grew deeper, more personal. "Are you afraid of what's happening between us?" he finally asked. Margaret looked at him. In Leo's eyes, there was something that scared her the most. Honesty. "I don't know what to call it." He ran his hand over the table, then stood up. He moved closer. Her breath caught in her throat. "Tell me to leave." She didn't. She couldn't. Leo leaned in, and at that moment Margaret realized they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The morning brought a heavy silence. Margaret felt that this day would be special, but she didn't know if it would be in a good or bad way. She looked at herself in the mirror. Fine wrinkles around her eyes, a slight flush on her cheeks from a sleepless night. Inside her, chaos raged, but outwardly, she remained calm. When there was another knock at the door, she knew it was Leo. He stood on the threshold, his gaze focused, almost tense. Margaret noticed how his fingers clenched into a fist before he relaxed his hand. "You're leaving?" Her voice was soft, but there was understanding in it. Leo nodded, looking down. "I can't stay, Margaret. It's not right." She felt her heart tighten. Her mind told her he was right, but something inside her resisted. They stood in silence for a long time, until she took a step forward and touched his hand. "Thank you for being here." Leo sighed, his lips trembling as if he wanted to say something important, but changed his mind. Then he leaned in and gently brushed his fingers against her cheek. "Take care of yourself." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning light. Margaret watched him until his figure vanished over the horizon. She didn't cry. Inside her, there was a strange feeling. Not emptiness, not pain, but something else. As if this wasn't the end, but just a new turn in her life. She closed the door and took a deep breath. Her life was beginning anew.